Hello everyone, my name is Rochelle Innocent and I'm the founder and CEO of Project Purpose. Welcome to our channel. Our community is focused on fostering the intellectual and character development in children. We do this through our parent-child workshops that are focused on 4 themes: autonomy, self-efficacy, compassion, and self-concept, in order to cultivate grit, perseverance, and resilience in each child. At Project Purpose, our overarching mandate is to renew and rebuild family, community, and relationships. Our different social media platforms provide us with an opportunity to have discussions on all topics that relate to family, community, and relationships with ourselves as well as with others, with a primary focus on mental health and education. More precisely, the ways that the institutions of mental health and education play a role and have played a role in our societies at large. These discussions and debates provide us with an opportunity to think critically about what needs to change within these structures for us to live up to our bold slogan: support, protect, and empower each child through youth-focused development, better known as leadership in juvenescence. We recognize that in valuing our children's leadership potential, this also translates as recreating and co-creating environments socially and politically that will enable our children to thrive. For those of you who are particularly keen on the topic, we also write thought pieces every other Sunday, and we actually just dropped a thought piece this past Sunday. So definitely be sure to meander over to the website and check out our online content. If it is the case that you are looking for a listening alternative, well, we're available on 10 different podcast platforms for your listening leisure, and we provided you with access to the links in the description down below. Now, as is the convention, be sure to subscribe, hit that post notification bell so that you are aware of every time we post. And of course, if you like these conversations and you want to keep them going, like, comment, and share this segment. Let's get into it. Allô les meufs et les mecs. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another segment here on Project Purpose. For those of you who are new, we cover topics that relate to mental health, mental wellness, and education on a week-by-week basis. And today our topic of discussion is mental health. And on our topic of discussion of mental health, we're going to be talking about the touchy, prickly subject of actually needing to enforce our boundaries by making good on the consequences when people are continuously pushing the limit on the boundaries that we've set. And I think this is the part of the conversation that we typically shy away from, because we like to talk about putting boundaries in place, but then what happens and at what point do we actually have to enforce consequences when it is the case that those boundaries have been breached? And I am someone who recognizes that when it is the case that I put a boundary in place, it doesn't automatically mean that everyone orients accordingly. There are some people who aren't super thrilled about the fact that they have to abide by a certain boundary, or who have no intention to abide by that certain boundary. And in that case, you need to move towards consequence. And that's where we're all sort of at a different level by way of comfort in actually putting those consequences into actions. The only thing is, if it is the case that you have a boundary with no consequence, then that boundary is essentially empty, right? It's not a real boundary if there's no consequences to support enforcing that boundary. So in that sense, I'd like to give you some food for thought, some things to keep in mind to help you stay the course in maintaining your boundaries by enforcing those consequences. And I'm going to give you some things that I keep in mind when it comes to the time for me to impart a consequence because of a breach of a boundary. And again, this isn't something that is fun for anyone. I think all of us would just appreciate if everyone respected and abided by the boundaries that we establish, but that's just not the real world. So when it comes time to actually enforce your boundary, I'd like to give you some things to keep in mind. And these are the 3 core things that I keep in mind when I have to impart a consequence. And this is about self-respect, right? And I impart the consequences because I've already communicated, I've given the time, I've given the support, whatever it is that I felt that I needed to help the other individual sort of abide by the boundaries that I've established. But there comes a time where, you can only support someone so much when it starts to infringe on your own sense of self-worth, your own sense of self-respect, and that is is obviously going to have a negative impact on our mental health. So at some point, for those who don't really care to cater to our boundaries and to respect the boundaries that we've established, consequence is the next step. And for those of you who feel anxiety about having to like hold someone to a consequence, I'm here to give you some things to think about. And these are the top 3 things to think about when it comes time to hold the boundary in place by imparting a specific consequence. So the first one is how you feel about someone really should not play a role into how that consequence translates. And this is really important because sometimes the consequences that we need to impart on others are people we like, right? They're people that we really like, that we really appreciate, but they're kind of putting us between a rock and a hard place, or we feel as though we're between a rock and a hard place because communication just isn't working. There's nothing that has really worked out that made it so that this is something that's a quick fix that we can resolve, that we can move past. So as a result, now I need to like enforce a consequence. I need to show that my words carry weight, that I make true in the promises that I make to others and to myself. And how we feel about someone really doesn't play a role in that. And sometimes what clouds your judgment by way of consequence, where we want to maybe change the consequence a little bit or maybe make the consequence less severe, is our emotional attachment to that person despite some of what's been going on in the background. And I'm here to say that the consequences need to be aligned to the actions, whether or not there's an emotional attachment there. And this is for you. So when you state the boundary and when you indicate why that boundary is significant, why it's important, why it needs to be respected and maintained, the consequence should align with how that breach has impacted you and not shift and change based on how you feel about the person who's breached that boundary. And I think that sometimes can be a confusing dynamic to sort through. And I think that it's very different. We need to demarcate between how we feel about someone from like how that behavior has impacted us, and the consequence has to do with the impact and how we can mitigate having any of that exposure to further harm moving forward. And again, remove emotional attachment from the equation is like the easiest way to cloud your judgment and on compromising. And I think when it comes to boundaries, enforcing our boundaries, it's so important that we don't compromise on our boundaries because we're telling ourselves that we're not worth the boundary that we've put in place. So when we have a boundary, when it comes time to enact and to enforce that boundary with a consequence, recognize that enforcement has to do with the action and the harm that was done, not to do with how much or how little you like the person. Very important. The second tip that I need to give you, and it's funny because it's about really reframing the emotive aspect of holding someone to a consequence. And sometimes when it is the case that we need to enforce a consequence, we feel like we're punishing ourselves. We're like, well, I'm gonna hurt equally by enforcing this consequence. And a lot of the times, like especially in relational situations, when we're enforcing a consequence because a boundary was breached, we sometimes assume that the person who's like decided as a result of this action, this is how we're gonna move forward. And that involves maybe the erosion of that relationship. You're like, you think to yourself, well, why are you upset? It's because both of us are going to be impacted by this consequence, but the consequence is a byproduct of the boundary, and the boundary is in place because it's how I communicate to myself that I respect myself, that I honor myself, and I recognize my worth and my value and how I ought to be treated. And so I think that it's important that we realize that we're helping ourselves by upholding consequences that enforce the boundaries that we have in place, even if it doesn't feel that way in the moment. So even though there's temporary pain, there's long-term gain because we know that we can hold others accountable to the boundaries that we establish to them. And I think that builds a sense of mental fortitude. It builds into our sense of self-confidence or sense of self-worth, because an empty boundary, again, there can be a lot of harm in place by an empty boundary. So when you establish a boundary and someone keeps stepping all over the boundary and you allow them to, you're communicating to yourself and to them that, you know, that boundary really was like an option. It was optional to respect that boundary, and how it communicates my sense of self-worth, my sense of self-respect. It doesn't have the significance that I actually have placed on the boundary, or I don't actually see myself as worthy of that kind of respect or that kind of honor if I'm not feeling inclined to enforce those boundaries with a consequence. And those are not messages that we want to relate back to ourselves. We want to make sure that when we establish boundaries, we are convicted that that boundary communicates to ourselves and to others how we show up, the respect we feel we ought to have, how we see ourselves by way of our own sense of self-worth, our own sense of value. And that's what permeates in the social settings and in the interactions that we have with others. And unfortunately, it will be the case that we have to enforce those boundaries with consequences. And those consequences are just an additional communicator. I stand by what it is that I say. My actions will support how it is that I communicate my sense of worth, my sense of value, the way I feel I ought to be respected. And that's not something I'm going to compromise on. I'm not going to sheer veer away from that in the face of opposition. And so my last point, and I mentioned this a little bit in my second point, and that's short-term pain, long-term gain. And I think that when it comes to enforcing consequences, it's not fun. No one enjoys having to, create disruption as a byproduct of enforcing a boundary. No one wants to deal with the confrontation or with the prickly conversations or the discomfort that comes with having to enforce a boundary. But that's what happens when it is the case that people don't feel inclined to behaviorally respect the boundaries that we have in place. They need to learn that respecting the boundaries is non-negotiable. Even if that means that I'm hurting in the short term, I'm happy to take on the weight of my decision to enforce a consequence as a byproduct of supporting my boundaries, because I recognize that in the long run, it's going to be better for everyone involved. If everyone recognizes that boundaries are non-negotiable, that respecting boundaries are non-negotiable, and the way that they become non-negotiable is with the consequences that we put in place. So I think those are the top 3 just rationales to keep in mind when it comes time for you to impart a consequence because a boundary of yours isn't being respected. It's important that you recognize that whatever boundaries that you establish, that you put in place, that you hold to yourself, that you believe in defending these boundaries because of what they communicate back to you. And I think that can be difficult, but it's always worthwhile because you're worthwhile. You're worth having the people that you surround yourself with, that you give access to yourself, people who respect your boundaries and want to build sustainable relationships by being, reciprocal members of respecting one another's boundaries. That's sort of the crux of having healthy, long-sustaining relationships. And then everyone else simply need not apply. And again, it doesn't matter how much you like them, if they can't respect your boundaries, if they feel inclined to push the needle, to push the limits, to see how much will you take, how much will you allow me to sort of step outside the bounds that you've established. I think those kinds of personalities are not the kind of personalities that you want to give access to your energy regardless. And sometimes that means that you have to step up to the plate and put action where your words sort of stay. And I think that it can be hard, it can be uncomfortable, but it's definitely always worth it. In any case, that's our topic for today. Before letting you go, I have one specific announcement that I'm really excited about. When it comes to our resilience building parent-child workshops, we've now provided you with a payment solution that allows you to pay in 4 installments over a period of 6 weeks to make the module more accessible to you. So we're very excited to be able to offer you alternative payment options. And also we will be going live at least twice a month, every month for the foreseeable future on our Facebook page. So definitely be sure to join in on our live events. Now these events are paid events. They are facilitated in such a way where we're cultivating the critical thinking and the life skills required to derive more meaning and fulfillment out of life. So definitely stay tuned for that. And also if you do see yourself participating in our community on an ongoing basis, then I suggest that you take a look at one of our package plans. So we do offer package plans, and with our package plans, you have unlimited access to our live events, as well as access to our webinars and workshops over and above those live events. So definitely be sure to tune in to see what works best for your level of engagement and commitment as you participate in our growing and evolving game changer community, because all of us are game changers. We have the potential to be game changers either way. It's up to us to take that gamut and to push the needle on change. And I do believe that each of us carries weight in being able to impact our world for the better. So that's it for today. I'm so happy to be able to engage with you, to chat with you, and I look forward to seeing you next time. We'll see you soon.